Again, thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Fake News and Media Literacy During the American Revolution. Our leader for this session is historian Jordan E. Taylor. I also want to note that we're joined by Kyle Smith of Superior High School, Superior, Wisconsin. Thank you so much, Kyle, for joining us. We appreciate the hard work and everything that you are doing on the Teacher Advisory Council. Kyle will be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources throughout the evening. Jordan Taylor is a historian of media and politics in early America. He is the author of Misinformation Nation, Foreign News and the Politics of Truth in Revolutionary America, which was published last year and won the Research Society for American Periodicals Book Prize. His academic articles on topics ranging from newspaper printers' role in the slave trade to an exploration of the impact of winter weather on early modern communications have appeared in the Journal of the Early Republic, 18th Century Studies, Early American Studies, Book History, and elsewhere. He has also written for Slate, The Daily Beast, The Washington Post, and Time Magazine. He is based in Bloomington, Indiana, where he currently works as an editor and as an adjunct instructor for Indiana University. Without further ado, I present to you all Jordan E. Taylor. We are honored, sir, to have you with us tonight, and we are truly looking forward to hearing your talk. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, and hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be talking to you here today in this warm and lively space about a topic that I care a great deal about. So thanks to Mike, thanks to Raven for setting this all up, and thanks to Kyle for helping us out tonight in the chat. And of course, thanks to all of you for attending. It's great to be in this space with you. So I wanted to start tonight with a story from 1794 involving a white refugee from the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue. His name was Claude Corentin Tanguy de Lavoisier. He had fled the Haitian Revolution, and he had left behind a plantation and a business as a newspaper printer. When he got to Philadelphia, where a lot of refugees like him had gathered, he decided to start another newspaper, which he called the American Star. And a notice that he published to try to stir up interest among potential subscribers, you can see it on the screen now, he promised that his paper would, quote, show things such as they really are by providing a faithful mirror of world events. In fact, though, Tanguy was not an impartial observer. He had lost a great deal of wealth as a result of the upheavals of the French and the Haitian revolutions. And in the American Star, this newspaper that he published, he shared news of the excesses of these revolutions at every opportunity. And he was often frustrated to see other newspapers printing material that he just didn't trust. In only the fifth issue after he started publishing the American Star, Tanguy described how other papers had shared a story that, quote, was doubtful on Monday, on Wednesday it is supposed, be shown to be fictitious. So he lectured these printers that they should be doing better. Quote, a journal is an echo, but it should, as much as possible, be an echo of truths. In the weeks between his prospectus and that fifth issue, where he's complaining about other newspapers, his hopes, he was tangling really for the first time with the rough and tumble of the American marketplace for news. And his hopes for his newspaper started to deflate as he passed from this hopeful visual image of a faithful mirror to a more pragmatic metaphor of an echo of truths. Tanguy's frustrations were shared by his neighbors. Most Americans felt that their news media should reflect reality as effortlessly as does a mirror, but they were often frustrated to get only distorted echoes. Americans dreamed of a republic with well-informed citizens, but they often found themselves immersed in falsehood, confused, and suspicious. There was a song actually playing at the beginning of this webinar. I don't know the song, but I think I probably should, because I think the refrain was something like "Suspicion is the new religion," and I think that's essentially where we were in the late 18th century as well. So this gap between hopes for truth and a more grounded reality is what I explore in my book, Misinformation Nation. And the argument of the book really is that false news, as well as fears of false news, guided the political movements of the American Revolution. You should have been given access, I believe, to the introduction and the third chapter of the book, which, if you had a chance to look at those, you'll find that overlaps a bit with some of tonight's presentation toward the end. I'm also working on a second book called Democracy's Dark Arts, that focuses specifically on the founders' relationship to these issues, truth and falsehood, and their view about the proper relationship between truth and democracy. That's something, some of the material I'm working on for that book is going to be relevant to tonight's presentation as well. So tonight I'm going to share some of this research, and we'll start by looking at how the news media functioned and the techniques that colonists used to try to determine what news was true and what was false. The spoiler here, to be honest, is that most of the things they tried didn't really work. American colonists' inability to cope with misinformation turned out to have some powerful political effects, and we're going to examine those effects through a couple of extended case studies. So first, we will look at how misinformation guided patriot politics and supported the logic of patriot mobilization in the 1760s and the 1770s. Then after that, we're going to look at how the founders' fears of misinformation guided them as they constructed new political institutions for the young republic in the 1780s and the 1790s. And then we'll conclude just by trying to think through the implications of this material and what it might mean for us today. Before we do that, though, I think it's worth addressing why this is a topic worth caring about. To put it bluntly, why have I spent the last decade of my life working on these questions when I could have been having fun or making money or doing something else with that time? But in the last few years, I think Americans have really started to recognize that the United States has a big problem with the way that it produces and consumes information. Some of us believe that this is a profound threat to our democracy. And there's a lot of different explanations, a lot of different diagnoses about the cause of this problem. Some people think social media or YouTube are the culprit for providing a fertile ground for the seeds of doubt to grow into full-blown conspiracy theories and things like that. Other people are more inclined to blame traditional media like newspapers or even cable TV, some of which are competing for attention by emphasizing conflict and treating the news almost like a reality TV show. And still others argue that there's something deeper here, that there's a strain of anti-intellectualism and distrust of institutions in American life that has sort of grown over time into an allergy against all authority. Because of the way that this is so wrapped up in new media technologies and tools, a lot of us have concluded that this is a brand new set of problems, which are ultimately going to be solved by innovation, by new technologies, things like that. And I'm going to insist to you tonight that this is a problem as old as the American Republic. And when I started researching this material around 2010, I was somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I was hoping that if we start at the beginning of this problem, started at the beginning really of self-government in the United States, we could better understand the nature of this problem with the way that we consume information. Perhaps I could find some big ideas or some models that could help us to understand a route forward. And this is the part where I might disappoint some of you, I really didn't find much timeless wisdom among the writings and ideas of the founding generation. In fact, the founders' ideas about how to solve these issues, as we'll see, were pretty terrible in a lot of ways. But I think the founders' failures can be highly instructive to us. We can use their example to think through why we have failed to tame the misinformation problem of our present, and how we can do better. So, because I'm about to launch into a long section, I wanted to ask Mike if there are any sort of opening questions before we dive in.
Good deal. We have a single question that we have from Eric, and his question is, and maybe you'll address this a little bit later on, but his question is what do you consider as reliable news media today? I know it's a difficult question.
It is a difficult question, partly because it's different depending on where you are. And it's also difficult because it's always changing, you know? Different outlets are bought out by different corporations, and they change over time, you know? A great newspaper can be gutted by a corporation that buys it out. So it's always changing. I myself, I think that one of the most important things that we can be doing is supporting investigative journalism. If that can happen at the local level, that's wonderful. If your local newspaper or other outlet is doing that kind of work, then I think that that's really important. At a national level, I think some of the work that ProPublica does, and they also work very much at the local level, is extraordinary. I always, when I get a question like this, I always try to plug ProPublica. If you're not plugged into what they do, I think they provide a great example of what journalism should be, that isn't just reactive to the headlines, but that is trying to push beyond the things that are fixating us day to day, and dive into some of the, you know, the things that you don't know are happening, that kind of thing. So that's one source I really like. I'm sure that we all have our individual sources that might make sense for your own interests or your localities, but yeah, that's one I'll recommend.
Absolutely. And I will say that your statement that founders' failures can be highly instructive. Our founders' failures can be highly instructive, which begs the question: why are we not necessarily heeding the instruction, or is it that we're just unaware of the failures?
That's a great question.
It's really interesting, and it's one that we'll solve over time. The question, there was a follow-up question. I will ask this really quickly, but the publication you mentioned again, if you will repeat that, there was a question that came in from Carrie, which is, what is the publication? Is it ProPublica?
Yes, ProPublica, ProPublica.
Good deal. All right. Okay, good deal. Thank you. We can move ahead. Appreciate it.
All right. So I think we need to start by trying to understand at just sort of a basic level how the news media worked in the 18th century. It's very different than the way that the news media works today. And one of the first things we need to understand is just the physical environment that the colonists inhabited in the 18th century in what's now the United States. So most people lived in small towns or in rural areas. But even if you lived in some of the biggest urban centers in these British American colonies, life was quite intimate. Even a big city like Boston, this is an engraving by Paul Revere of Boston in 1768. Even a big city like Boston had only about 15,000 inhabitants in 1770. That's tiny, right? If you took 15,000 people to Fenway Park today, you wouldn't even need to open the upper decks to fit everyone. It would look like, it would look like the kind of sparse turnout you'd expect on an afternoon game when the Sox are like 7 games back. So these were small communities, right? 15,000 people. That's a small community. There are few strangers. There is plenty of opportunity for gossip in a community like that. These are the sorts of places where grievances are echoed by neighbors, where outsiders are suspect, and where conspiracy theories abounded. This was also a time when news media was in a period of global transition. Newspapers were becoming more common in Europe and in its colonies, especially in the British Empire. And in part, this was because of widespread interest in news about global revolutionary events, things like the Glorious Revolution, the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, and really just all of the enormous wars that erupted around the world during the 18th century. It's worth noting as well that colonial American newspapers were very expensive to produce. They offered very low profit margins for their printers. For the most part, the only sorts of people who regularly subscribed to them were relatively well-off individuals. So people like merchants, doctors, military officers, political leaders, people like that. But because these readers did not keep a newspaper's contents to themselves, the press was able to set an agenda for much of the public conversation about global news. And this new medium allowed American colonists to participate in an ongoing conversation with Europe. It was a halting and mumbling conversation, as I'll get to, but it was a conversation nevertheless. And so people recognized that this was a powerful tool. And because it was a powerful tool, there was some question as to who should be allowed to sort of control it. Until the 18th century, there were really just 2 main ways that news moved around British North America, either in letters or rumors. And no one could control the flow of letters or rumors because that kind of exchange could occur in both public and private spaces. Because they were so centralized, in a sense, letters and rumors were quite democratic as information media. Anyone could participate in these communication forms equally. Newspapers were different. They were much more hierarchical. They allowed a single person, an editor, to mediate the experiences, the information that thousands of other people would encounter. And because this was so powerful, because this was an enormous responsibility, it was one, frankly, that most people didn't trust, inky-fingered newspaper printers with. So over years of trial and error and a number of court cases, which I won't get into tonight, newspaper printers came to sort of a tacit agreement with the colonial government in British America. The government would allow them to operate privately, but printers would have to remain neutral. If this was a video presentation, you would see me using air quotes, because neutrality in this case really just meant that they were not going to undermine the government. And so for decades, newspapers kept what has often been called an open press. They imagined their newspaper as a platform, not a publication, more like a bulletin board than a magazine. Many newspaper mottos in the 18th century insisted that the paper was, quote, open to all parties, but influenced by none. Printers insisted that their newspaper should be indifferent to the truth. They should be a place where all news was presented, allowing everyone to decide which accounts were true. Ben Franklin explained in one essay that his job was to share, quote, a great variety of things opposite and contradictory, because he trusted that, quote, when truth and error have fair play, the former is always an overmatch for the latter. In other words, he was happy to publish anything because he believed that truth would always defeat error. So okay, this concept of the open press was always a little bit of a convenient fiction, and I think even Franklin knew this. Colonial governors would not allow newspapers to publish everything, right? Because some news was harmful to their interests. But more importantly, the expansion of the London press in the 18th century meant that there was almost always far more printed news than American printers could republish. So American newspaper editors were unavoidably making judgments about what news was most worthy of inclusion in their pages. So the most important news, the news which took up the most sort of column inches in colonial American newspapers, was republished from European presses, especially from newspapers published in London. Anglo-American colonists understood that events in France, Great Britain, Spain, Austria, elsewhere, wherever, could have enormous consequences for them. Wars could spread, land deals could be made, and of course, laws could be passed that would change their lives. American colonists didn't care quite so much about local or regional news. In a 1739 poem in the Pennsylvania Gazette, Ben Franklin explained to his readers that he would not be sharing much news about Pennsylvania, even though it was called the Pennsylvania Gazette. So he wrote in this poem, "If home occurrences that are well known and which concern but few are left alone, the printer sure deserves no blame for this, while in foreign news he's not remiss, and what important ever happens here carefully collects and renders clear." So Franklin is saying, why would I reprint local news? Why would I share that on in my paper? My readers are going to hear about anything local on the streets much more quickly than I can print it. But newspapers' focus on foreign news presented some big problems. The first of these problems was that European sources very often were sharing incorrect information. Two sources from Europe rarely said the exact same thing about events. The second problem was, obviously there was 3,000 miles of ocean between events occurring in Europe and the American colonies. It usually took something between 6 weeks to 2 months for a ship to sail that distance, longer if it was wintertime. And all sorts of things could happen to news on the way. Letters could be lost. A ship with the latest news might be blown off course, or it might be seized by an enemy power. A sailor who learned something, who heard an account, might start to sort of embellish it a little bit over the course of those 6 weeks, or he might start to misremember it. And so almost inevitably, when ships started to arrive following a significant event abroad, they carried contradictory accounts. And because Americans were receiving so much contradictory information from Europe, it was often very difficult for people to determine what was true and what was false. Even as this new print medium accelerated the speed of news distribution, technologies that were used to verify information stalled. This was long before tools like the telegraph or the telephone arose that allowed news outlets to pretty easily verify information before they shared it. The only way to verify an account really in the 18th century was to just wait, maybe 3 months or so for an answer from someone you trusted in Europe. And I'll say this again, but I doubt you or I could do much better if we were back in the 18th century. People in the 18th century just did not have the tools to engage in anything like what we would today call journalism or reporting. And so individual readers and observers had to devise some way of separating truth from falsehood, not based on their ability to verify it, not based on any external sources, but based solely on the internal characteristics of a piece of news. This open press, which I was just discussing, had insisted that a printer should not exercise any kind of editorial judgment and should just reprint materials without concern for its truthfulness. That open press idea was based on an assumption that ordinary people basically have what we would call a high degree of media literacy, right? Today we think of media literacy as sort of this rational, structured approach to analyzing information. We think of it as a way of identifying misinformation and also seeking out trustworthy knowledge. In the 18th century, people would have thought of the process of analyzing news as being more like a process of uncovering, evil liars, evil deceivers. Identifying deception seemed to be a part of a never-ending war between good and evil, God and Satan, right and wrong. And Americans had this faith that ultimately they would be able to detect falsehoods, in part because they believed that the good would ultimately triumph over evil. People in early America, I really can't emphasize this enough, had no time for the idea of an innocent falsehood. People rarely considered the idea that others could unintentionally misremember something, or that one's senses could deceive a person. I think probably none of them had ever played that game we all play as children of telephone, right? Although, to be fair to them, the telephone had not yet been invented. So anyway, so as they saw it, if there was falsehood in the world, it was not just an accident, it wasn't a mistake, it was the specific and intentional product of a villainous deceiver. And if you look at the letters and the newspapers from the period, it's clear that American colonists developed a few techniques for detecting these daring deceivers. And so I'm going to run through what I consider to be three of the most important elements in the media literacy sort of toolkit available to most people living in British America and later in the early United States. So the first of these is if it was a printed piece of news or a letter, they would scrutinize what I refer to as the chain of evidence that was attached to it. So in 18th century America, newspapers often contained not a headline, but a sort of opening paragraph describing exactly how a piece of news originated and how it came to their paper. Letter writers were also quite precise about how they got their news because they knew that their correspondents wouldn't trust a piece of news without some indication of where it came from. So if you thought that someone was fabricating a piece of news, was making it up and falsely attributing it to a source from far away, all you really had to do was look closely at this chain of evidence. Did it line up with what you knew about the communications infrastructure of the early modern world? So, for example, we have this example here from a Philadelphia paper. This is a more or less random example that I chose. And it says, New York, December 2nd, a letter from a respectable gentleman, dated Amsterdam, September 8th, 1786, brought by Captain Boss, I don't know how to pronounce that, Boss, who arrived at Charleston, South Carolina, the 13th ultimo, that means previous month, so November. So this tells a reader quite a bit, actually. This meant that this particular piece of news, in this case a letter, originated in Amsterdam in September. It arrived on a boat to Charleston in November. It was reprinted in a New York newspaper in early December. That's what the New York heading there shows at the top. And it was again reprinted in the Philadelphia newspaper that published this account in early December. But if no ship arrived in Charleston on December 13th, or if no newspaper was published in New York on December 2nd, or if this captain, if someone managed to talk to Captain Boss and he denied the existence of such a letter, then you might have some grounds for doubt. And people did this. People would interview ship captains. They would look at the dates between things sometimes and calculate how quickly the chain of evidence had a piece of news traveling. And if the sequence of dates didn't line up with a reader's expectations for what was reasonable, they might question the reliability of the source. So this is tool number one in the media literacy toolkit in the 18th century. The second is if you are looking at a letter or an oral report, especially, sort of a rumor, right? Early American observers often focused on the social status of the person sharing this news. Was he, and it was usually a he, was he a reliable source? Was this what was called a gentleman of reputation? Or was this maybe someone who had nothing to lose by spreading false news? Newspapers that reprinted letters almost unfailingly supported them with claims that they were from, a gentleman of reputation, of undoubted veracity, great political information. Sometimes they called him a respectable citizen, an unquestioned authority, or a high authority. It's almost repetitive, the way that newspapers are focusing on the status of individuals. And this was unmistakably elitist, right? But it also, in addition to being elitist, had a kind of a logic to it. This was an era when wealthy gentlemen fiercely protected their reputations, including in duels, right? Many duels were fought because one party had accused the other of lying, essentially. Being branded a liar made a deep stain on a gentleman's reputation, and so readers assumed that wealthy gentlemen would not lie casually, right? And so it made some sense to trust their words more than trusting someone who had nothing to lose. And of course, this is not necessarily a hard and fast rule. And you would probably be happy to disregard news from the high and the mighty if you believe that they had some good reasons to lie. So that's the second toolkit, tool in this media literacy toolkit. The most powerful tool that most Americans used to identify falsehoods, though, was one that I think is very familiar to us. I saw this word floating around in the chat before I started, in fact. It was this sort of concept of political bias. As so many of us do today, Americans in the 18th century loved to dismiss sources that were aligned with their political adversaries, right? And this was, as new, as familiar as this is to us, this was relatively new in the late 18th century, especially. News sources didn't become extensively politicized until the second half of the 18th century, and prior to that, colonists generally had accepted that their newspapers reflected, a shared imperial purpose. And I'll talk more about this later, but when patriot colonists started to distrust British officials and the colonies and the British ministry in London, they also started to doubt news produced by outlets associated with the British government. They essentially accused them of bias. And this started a pattern in which Americans mostly engaged with news sources that they considered to be unbiased. In other words, sources that aligned with their own politics. I'm going to pause here for just a moment for three reasons. First, to take a drink of water. Second, to ask if anyone has any questions. And third, because I want to give you all a chance to reflect on how successful you think this kind of approach to information literacy would be, because the next few sections will be about how Americans applied these techniques.
Good deal. And again, I would encourage everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat. We'd be happy to bring them to Jordan's attention as well. I will say, Jordan, I guess one of the questions that could be raised is the influence of profit. Was that even a factor? We know that obviously today we have clickbait, we have so many different what I consider to be distractions in terms of media, but a lot of it is profit driven. Was there a profit motive in any way associated with any of these elements that you outlined earlier?
That's a fabulous question. So thank you for that. Absolutely. So there were. I talked a bit ago about this model, this economic model for newspapers in especially the early 18th century, right? They're sort of commercial in nature. They're serving merchants primarily, but also sort of wealthy elites. The American Revolution provides a different kind of a model. It says, so newspaper printers start to consider the possibility that maybe their primary audience is not going to be just gentlemen, elites, wealthy merchants, things like that, and instead it might be people who are committed to a political cause, right? And so, without probably ever making a decision about it, a lot of printers started to align themselves with these particular constituencies, which leads to a situation where printers who are publishing newspapers that are not aligned, that are somewhat neutral, where they become less profitable because they can't tap into this. Sort of marketplace that patriot and loyalist newspapers are finding for themselves. And this also creates a powerful incentive for patriot and loyalist newspapers to be ideologically consistent. There's a loyalist newspaper printer who I'll talk about in a few minutes named James Rivington, who always complains that whenever he publishes something that his readers don't like, he hears about it. And he sort of says, we should be doing this. Like, what happened to the open press, right? So there's this pressure that comes with the need to serve your subscribers. The whole clickbait phenomenon is associated with a different model of profitability, right? Which is advertising. It's about competing for attention in a highly competitive marketplace. But a subscription model can also be a little bit tricky, right? Because it does mean that you have to give your subscribers what they want, and sometimes what they want is not necessarily totally aligned with reality.
Good deal. Thank you so much. We have a question from Amy. The question starts: the idea of this being a bulletin board and not a content creator is interesting and reminds me of social media platform stances today. We host content and aren't responsible for what our users upload. Were newspapers ever sued for things they published? If so, were they vindicated based on this idea?
Another really good question. So, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. That's a great comparison with the way that Mark Zuckerberg and others have said, we are a platform, we aren't a publisher, and therefore we're not responsible for what appears on our pages, right? And that was a defense that newspaper printers tried to use. The quotation that I've had two quotations from Ben Franklin, and there will be more. But the first one that I shared with you about the open press was actually very much his defense of this practice because people were irritated at him for something that he published. There were a lot of cases where newspaper editors were sued. Famously, John Peter Zenger in New York was brought to court by the governor because he published some news that the governor didn't like. Ben Franklin's older brother James was really run out of the newspaper business by the governor of Massachusetts. And then there are a number of cases between 1798 and 1799, which I'll get to a little bit later, in response to the Sedition Act, where the government tried to hold newspaper printers responsible for what was considered seditious libel. But those examples have to do with the government, right? The government bringing suit against newspaper printers because the legal sort of precedent that newspapers were most vulnerable to in the 18th century had to do with speech that tended to destabilize government rather than speech having to do with individuals.
Great, thank you. We have a few other questions. I'll just ask one. In the interest of time, I'll focus on one for now, and it's from Kathy. Kathy's question is, were most newspapers prior to the Revolution considered loyalist? Were there loyalist newspapers that continued to publish during the Revolution in British strongholds like New York, like the New York City area?
Yeah, absolutely. So it would be difficult, I think, to describe any newspaper as loyalist before maybe the early 1770s, because there's not an activist loyalist movement until then that sort of thinks of itself as that. But it would be fair to say that most governments were highly supportive of the British government prior to the American Revolution. And yeah, absolutely. So James Rivington, he's someone I just mentioned. He's a New York City newspaper printer. And I'll talk a little bit about him in a few minutes. And there are quite a number of loyalist newspapers that continue to persist during the Revolution, but a lot of them are run out of business as soon as the Patriots sort of take control of a town, sometimes quite violently, in fact. But yeah, New York City especially was the center of loyalist publication in the British colonies during the war.
All right, thank you so much. We can move ahead. And again, once you have any additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Thank you again.
Okay, so I want us to spend a little bit of time looking at some of the crucial episodes of American revolutionary politics. And as we do so, I want us to sort of ask ourselves, how well informed were the decisions of the founding generation? And how did the fear of fake news guide Americans' political choices? So we should remind ourselves, before we even get into this, that the American Revolution was, in a lot of ways, quite an improbable thing. It took a lot for a group of relatively privileged, comfortable white men to convince themselves that the British ministry, that is, so I'll refer to the British ministry, that just means the Prime Minister and the leadership in Parliament, that these group of ministers in Britain were trying to strip them of their liberties. It took a lot for these privileged white colonists to see themselves as victims, if not, as some patriots hyperbolically put it, as slaves of British tyranny. It also took a lot for a few hundred colonists in what was widely considered to be a backwater to convince themselves that they played such an important part of the British Empire's economy that if they organized themselves against the empire, the ministry would have no choice but to negotiate on their terms. Even though these things were a little bit out there, I would say, over time the Patriots came to believe them, and they came to believe many other things that I would say are false, that were essential to their movement's ability to mobilize resistance to the empire. So the question is, how did they get there, right? In the 1760s, the American revolutionaries often insisted that the root cause of the widening breach with the British Empire was essentially just miscommunication. They believed that they were being misrepresented in Parliament. Even though Americans were a peaceful and a civil people, they believed that the king's representatives in the colonies were sending home an exaggerated portrait of colonial violence and anarchy. The Patriots insisted that sort of every scrape of the knee in the colonies was being turned into a riot or a rebellion by colonial officials. One of the earliest of these occasions involved a smuggler named Daniel Malcolm. So after customs officials asked him to open his cellar, where they were expecting to find wine that he had failed to pay taxes on, tariffs, duties, a mob formed and intimidated this group of essentially tax collectors away. And so Malcolm celebrated the result of this intimidation by offering buckets of smuggled wine to the crowd. So this was in 1766. After this, a Boston town meeting got worried. They thought that the governor would probably stir up what they called a partial account of the event in order to excite a groundless jealousy, they wrote. So they sent their own depositions about the event, which really very much minimized the drama involved. This was a pattern that played out many, many times over the next few years. Some riot or act of resistance would play out, and the town meeting in a place would convene and try to explain to a London audience that, well, look, really it wasn't all that bad. Sure, maybe things got a little bit out of hand for a moment, but we colonists, we're fundamentally loyal. This is a peaceful place, and really any disorder is the result of aggressive tax collectors or soldiers. And while a lot of this fear about misrepresentation was speculative, the Patriots did find some evidence. Occasionally, they were able to get a hold of letters seized from royal governors and other officials that they believed proved that these men were misleading the king and the ministry. So, for example, the colonists discovered that when British troops were first expected to arrive in Boston, that the lieutenant governor at the time, Thomas Hutchinson, he shared an unfounded rumor with his superiors in London that the Patriots were organizing to attack the troops as they landed. As they sought to correct the record, the colonists sent petitions, pamphlets, resolves, letters, and instructions to their contacts in London. But the Patriots' efforts to undeceive the king and the Tory ministry, led by, at this point, Lord Frederick North, essentially came to nothing. Over time, the Patriots concluded that the ministry were not the dupes of colonial officials, but rather that the British government was probably in on this whole campaign of deception from the beginning. Hoping to seize colonial autonomy, the Patriots believed that the ministry was trying to trick the British public into supporting an invasion and a reorganization of the colonies. The Patriots were essentially accusing the British ministry of running what conspiracy theorists today would call a false flag operation. In other words, inventing or wildly exaggerating accounts of colonial resistance in order to justify retaliatory actions. Reading the newspapers in London, the Patriot faction found that the only presses that actually took them seriously and which questioned the ministry's narrative of events belonged to the opposition party, which they were known as the Whigs. Meanwhile, the newspapers published by or subsidized by the British government seemed to be, unsurprisingly, much harsher toward the colonists. So, to most Patriot colonists, these sorts of sources seemed to be totally untrustworthy. If anything, they were a part of the ministry's plan to subjugate the colonies without losing popular support at home. And so I alluded to this a minute ago in response to a question, but Patriot newspapers were coming into their own at this time. These newspaper printers were emboldened by years of open defiance, and so they were no longer worried about being critical of the colonial government. And even as they tried to organize Patriot resistance, newspapers were also trying very earnestly to make sense of what was happening in London. And, as colonial resistance escalated, this became more important than ever, understanding what was happening in London. If you could understand the intense, the weaknesses and the next moves of the ministry, you could find better tactics to undermine them. If you could follow the moods and the attitudes of the king and his nobles, the Patriots could seek out new methods of persuasion. And if they could understand who were their potential allies in Parliament and in the streets, then they could support and encourage those groups. And so the Patriots' strategy for mobilization and resistance depended very much on what they understood to be the internal political dynamics of the London elite. And so the Patriot press and Patriot observers scrutinized news from London closely according to those media literacy standards that were prominent at this time. They often tossed out news based on the chain of evidence attached to it. I found one case, for example, from 1774, where a Patriot reader cast doubt on the news contained in a letter because it described news passing from Boston to Philadelphia in only 4 days. So this writer explained, quote, "How the post could carry in 4 days this account to Philadelphia is beyond my comprehension." So he explained that this was, quote, "just one instance among many of the lying tricks of our enemies." In other words, implying that the loyalists were fabricating this news and falsely attributing it to a distant source. So naturally, this was applied selectively. Patriot printer rarely, if ever, accused another Patriot printer of sharing something without a genuine source. Patriots also boasted that the letters they were receiving from London were from respectable gentlemen, and this was almost certainly true. The colonists' principal allies in London were wealthy merchants who profited from trade with the colonies. Following their own economic interests, these merchants generally encouraged the Patriots to push for reconciliation. They assured their Patriot correspondents that their allies were numerous and that their resistance would not be in vain. And perhaps most importantly, the Patriots used accusations of political bias to undermine information that originated from newspapers associated with the London ministry. They mocked and dismissed ministry papers like the London Gazette and the ministry's official mouthpiece, the London Chronicle and the mouthpiece, the London Gazette, which they sometimes referred to as the lying Gazette. When I counted the citations that Patriot printers made to foreign newspapers, I found that they were much, much less likely than their loyalist rivals to share news from ministry sources. And because they were dismissing the news sources associated with the British government, Patriots inevitably became more dependent on Britain's radical and opposition papers like the Morning Chronicle or the Public Ledger. And they, at the same time, Patriot printers became more intolerant of loyalist printers and dissent in the press. Patriot mobs, as I alluded to earlier, sometimes threatened or even destroyed loyalist presses. And so the result was that Patriots started taking as fact the boasts, the dreams of the London opposition. And in particular, they took on board what I would consider three crucial propositions. So first, they believed that the Patriot cause was very popular in Britain. Second, they believed that the Tory ministry, the ministry led by Frederick North, was vulnerable. And third, they believed that the colonists were essential to Britain's economic community. These were all things that they found well supported in the opposition press. And indeed, for years, these three propositions formed the core of the Patriots' theory about how they could bring about change in the empire without violence. So they pushed for colonists to boycott British goods, refusing to buy from British merchants and to not consume goods that were made in Britain. And they believed that by withdrawing participation in the imperial economy, colonists would produce widespread unemployment in Britain, since so much of British industry, they believed, depended on processing colonial resources and on making consumer goods for the colonists. And as a result of this economic disruption, they thought that discontented Britons would riot, essentially, until Lord North fell from power and a more conciliatory leadership replaced him. So this vision of the future, this theory of change, made sense to the leaders of the London opposition, and it made sense to the London merchants who bought and sold American goods, but it was never very realistic to anyone else. Okay, so here's the part where I pause and just say, I don't want to be too harsh on the Patriots in this moment. The founding generation were not unintelligent. They were not just credulous. In a lot of ways, they were dealt a bad hand. They were living in a time when information moved quickly, but where knowledge was incredibly slow. There were no opinion polls, there were no neutral papers, professional journalists, no government reports. They didn't have technologies, again, that allowed them to verify news. So instead, as I said earlier, they could only evaluate news according to its internal characteristics. And so right? They had to rely on their media literacy skills and their instincts to make a choice. They could believe the exaggerated claims of the ministry, which appeared to be conspiring against them, or they could trust the equally exaggerated claims of an opposition that seemed to appreciate them. So it's not hard to understand, really, why patriots trusted the opposition more than the ministry sources. But the perceptions they took from the opposition, these were almost entirely wrong, right? The North ministry was actually very popular. It lasted until the end of the war. When there were elections in 1774, North's coalition actually gained strength. North was an incredibly skilled politician who held his coalition together longer than any prime minister in recent years. Moreover, the British people, especially outside of London, were enthusiastic about humbling and challenging these refractory colonists. There was a fairly vocal American lobby, pro-American lobby in Britain, but it was never as numerous or as powerful as the Patriots hoped. And the Patriots' boycotts never produced the kind of massive economic impacts on Britain that their allies predicted. We know this because the Patriots organized boycotts several times without causing much distress in Britain. And the fact that the Patriots' theory of change was based on these false premises meant that it failed. Of course it failed. It had to fail. It was impossible for their approach to bring about a regime change or to bring about a reconciliation. And so all that was left really for them to do was to stumble into confrontation and into war. And even though I don't want to be too harsh on the Patriots, we should acknowledge as well, this isn't just a case of like a smug historian using the benefit of hindsight to question the wisdom of those who were living, sort of in the fog of war. And in fact, the Patriots' loyalist neighbors understood the Patriots had been misled. So in 1774 and 1775, for example, a debate broke out in a New York loyalist newspaper printed by, who I mentioned earlier, James Rivington, and you can see this image of him, and a neighboring Patriot paper printed by a man named John Holt. So in this debate, essayists accused each other of sharing only news that suited their political aspirations. So a loyalist accused the Patriot printer of only sharing intelligence that disparaged the ministry and the parliament, intended to widen the breach between Great Britain and the colonies. Patriots responded by accusing Rivington of publishing such parts of letters from London and elsewhere as can be made to suit their purpose and suppressing the rest. And if you look at what these two papers were publishing, these accusations are mostly true. Because Holt and Rivington, they published in the same city, and generally they published on the same day of the week, you might expect that some of the news that they published would overlap, that some of it would be the same. But actually, it rarely was. If we read Holt's paper, you conclude that the British ministry was distressed that the London opposition was emboldened. If you read Rivington's paper, you got almost the exact opposite sense. And the fascinating thing is that neither of these information mediators simply fabricated these reports. Neither of them just pulled them out of thin air. They had made choices about what news they were going to share because they had more news available than they had space to share it in. And because they had to make choices, they used, again, this same media literacy toolkit I talked about earlier. It led them in different directions, though. So what went wrong, right? The Patriots' failed approach to media literacy can offer us, I think, some useful lessons. Those of us who are educators who are interested in helping ourselves and others consume information in a more productive way might take some lessons here. So first of all, and I hope this doesn't need to be said, but we should all, I think, understand that possessing wealth and such social authority does not necessarily make a person trustworthy. As recent experience has shown, wealthy people can be quite unscrupulous. They can be liars. I apologize if I'm offending any billionaires or oligarchs in attendance tonight, but I think that's indisputably true. When we're helping people to engage better with our information ecosystem, we need to help them to distinguish carefully between different kinds of authority. In early America, authority and expertise clustered around the same group of people, but today we spread it out more diffusely among different kinds of specialists. There are political authorities, legal authorities, scientific authorities, public health authorities, and a million other kinds of people who know a lot about a particular topic. Too often, though, radicals would view all knowledge as bondage and all consensus as conspiracy. But we know that it is possible to know things, and we know that with humility and discipline, much can be learned. And so to defer to a question's relevant authority, the person who knows the most about a particular topic, is not the same as making an argument from authority as was done in the 18th century. And as these examples from revolutionary America suggest, teaching people to falsify information and think in terms of bias can actually be counterproductive. It can sort of build an echo chamber effect because partisans apply their scrutiny mostly to news that they instinctively distrust already. A more effective approach to help others identify what's true, a more effective approach is to help others identify what's true rather than what's false. In other words, that means approaching a piece of information not as sort of a true-false proposition where you're sort of answering a question on a true-false quiz, but rather using a piece of news or a tweet or something as a starting point for seeking out knowledge. This would have been very difficult for the founding generation to pull off. I'll say that once again. This version of media literacy only really works in a world where shared standards of evidence and unaligned institutions can exist to produce knowledge. And so I think the crucial lesson to draw here is that campaigns for media literacy cannot work without being accompanied by functioning institutions that can produce, distribute, and verify knowledge. Media literacy can't happen in a vacuum. It's only realistic with the support of experts and professionals who are primarily focused on the pursuit of truth rather than the pursuit of attention. So with that, I'll pause again before moving into some hopefully much quicker case studies, and then we'll start to wrap up. So any questions?
Good deal. Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a few questions, and I want to let everyone know that we have about 20 minutes remaining in our webinar for this evening. Again, thank you all for your questions. One question we have from Andrew is, to what extent did the Crown leverage the governors of the colonies to spin the narratives they wanted here in the Americas? To what extent did the Crown... I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we would be surprised by how indifferent the British monarchy was. So King George III didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the colonies. Of course, the colonists think that that there's nothing that anyone is ever thinking about in London but their resistance. In fact, I think they were mostly distracted by other things. And so I don't think that there's necessarily a sense that that colonial governors are actually responsible for spinning a particular narrative. And in fact, a lot of governors feel like they're being ignored by the government at home, by the ministry, or by the Secretary of State for the colonies. They're always writing a lot more letters home than they're getting back. And so you know, I think in a lot of ways, governors are standing outside of this argument about truth, even though the colonists very frequently blame them for everything that seems to be going wrong.
Okay. We have another question from Gloria. Her question is, how did religion play out into the press? Or how did religion play into the press? That's the question.
Can I postpone that question a little bit, because I'm going to address something related to that in just a few minutes.
Okay, good deal. The next question is, did the Patriot and Loyalist military leaders read newspapers and contribute to them? What was the literacy rate in the military ranks on both sides and in the general population of the colonies, if you know?
Yeah, the literacy rates were quite high. Depended a bit on where you're looking at. Literacy rates are higher in New England and in the Middle Colonies, a little bit lower in the South. And certainly, if you're that applies most to white populations, and slave populations are forbidden from learning to read and write, sometimes under punishment of the law. So military leaders were absolutely involved in the production of news. Lord Dunmore, who is the governor of Virginia and becomes a kind of military leader, he publishes a newspaper from a boat in I think the James River. I might be mistaken about the particular river, but Thomas Gage in Boston is involved in limiting the impact of the Patriot press in that region. And George Washington is very frustrated. George Washington is always very frustrated with people, but he's very frustrated by what he considers to be the lies that are undermining Patriot morale and that are misleading the people about the status of the war.
Good deal. Thank you for that. I'll ask one more question, and we'll reserve some questions for the end if we have time. But a question from Cal. His question is, how would you view the Boston Massacre from the lens of media literacy?
So I mentioned... Oh, sorry to cut you off.
You're perfect. You're perfectly fine. That was me. I'm sorry. I was going to repeat the question, but you have it, so we can move ahead. Thank you. Good.
Yeah, so the Boston Massacre is one of those events that I alluded to earlier where colonists create competing explanations for the event, and the colonial governor, the soldiers, sort of British loyalists, complete a completely different set of narratives. And it's very interesting, actually, because that competing set of narratives is still, in a lot of ways, the most complete archive we have for understanding this event. But we also have to understand it as a competition, as people arguing about what had just happened and trying to set an agenda for a response. So the conflicting depositions that are given in the Preston trial that follow the Boston Massacre are often, I think, great teaching tools because they can help students to see multiple perspectives. But they're also, I think, I haven't actually done this, but they might be really interesting to think about contemporary media literacy issues because they were also the product of essentially partisan media. Yeah.
Good deal. And thank you all for those questions. We'll move ahead. We have about 15 more minutes remaining. Okay. So thank you again for answering those questions.
Okay, great. So the founders understood that their world was awash in falsehood. They knew this from their firsthand experience in spreading misleading information. Sam Adams was involved in helping to radicalize Boston in the 1760s with exaggerated or invented accounts of the behavior of British troops. Thomas Jefferson was not averse to sending newspaper material in which he pretended to be someone he was not. And Ben Franklin was really sort of a king of false stories, both while he worked at the Pennsylvania Gazette and for years afterwards. After the War for Independence, false news seemed to be particularly dangerous, and they believed that, and the founders believed that several groups of villains were responsible for spreading it. They thought that news that had some bearing on the nation's diplomacy was the work of foreign provocateurs. News that had an impact on the economy could be traced back to speculators and merchants who were trying to manipulate prices and manipulate the economy to their own profit. And any news that they disliked, political leaders tended to blame on domestic demagogues. With so much false news circulating, and with even more fears about false news, the founders were deeply nervous about how self-government could withstand so much misinformation. Um, in 1786, a group of indebted, overtaxed Massachusetts residents launched a rebellion, later called Shays's Rebellion. And for many elites, it seemed as if this event had been a product of false news. One writer insisted the next year that the minds of the people must have been poisoned by misinformation and lies to be led into rebellion. Many of the founders would have agreed. At the Constitutional Convention, which Shays's Rebellion had played no small part in bringing about, a Massachusetts delegate named Elbridge Gerry, who was an elite merchant, thought that ordinary people should allow elites like himself to dominate the government. And his stated reasoning in this room full of other elites is that he believed ordinary people were just much too easily misled by falsehoods. During an early discussion about whether the lower house of the national legislature, what would become the House of Representatives, should be elected directly by the people or by state legislatures, Gerry argued that they could not be trusted, that ordinary people could not be trusted to pick the right representatives. He said that this was the very reason that the Confederation government founded in the 1780s was falling apart. He said, "The evils we experience flow from an excess of democracy. The people do not want virtue, but are the dupes of pretended patriots. In Massachusetts, it had been most fully confirmed by experience that they are daily misled into the most baneful measures and opinions by the false reports circulated by designing men, which no one on the spot can refute." So everyone in that room would have recognized that as a clear reference to Shays's Rebellion. So for Gerry and others, the American people were not evil. They were virtuous, but they could only make decisions based on the information they had. And ordinary people were too easily misled by false information provided by demagogues. And so for Gerry and other wealthy elites, they believed that they were the only appropriate people to be making important decisions. Because they were educated and well-informed, they would be able to discern what was true and what was false. So after the Constitution was ratified and George Washington became president, his administration saw a great deal of wrangling over truth. Initially, this was sort of optimistic. There was an effort to create schools, libraries, and other institutions to help ensure that the citizenry would be well informed. In 1792, the American Congress decided to set an extremely low postage rate for newspapers because they hoped that this would spread useful information more widely. And this was regarded as a major achievement in the struggle against popular ignorance. With the passage of this legislation, a North Carolina congressman named John Steele explained, quote, "If the people hereafter remain uninformed, it must be their own fault." For Steele and for others, the essential problem was about accessing a significant quantity of information. He didn't really seem to consider issues of information quality, but the more information that was available to people, the more well-informed they would be. But as the nation's politics became more polarized and partisan during the 1790s, Americans lost faith in the idea that more news would create a more well-informed citizenry. So in the 1790s, there was a split between the Federalist Party, led by Washington, Adams, Hamilton, and others, which was more favored a more centralized government, closer relations with Britain. And then there was the Republican Party, right, which was more opposed to centralization, which was much more French in sympathy and was led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So each party saw in the other a mix of deceivers and dupes, people who were feeding hungry followers with a diet of falsehoods. During the 1790s, these two political parties reached something of a deadlock. They were really unable to convince the other side of its errors. You know, how can you, when your rivals seem to be so deeply deluded? Stop me if this starts to sound familiar. And so there were a couple of ways that political leaders tried to solve this seemingly unsolvable problem. When he was Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson hated that most American newspapers were full of information reprinted from British sources. He felt strongly that the American press needed to avoid viewing the world through the prism of the London press. He was very suspicious of the British Empire and very sympathetic toward France, and he worried that Britain was conducting a kind of information warfare in a long-term bid to retrieve its former colony. So to solve this problem, he basically sneakily used State Department funds to support a new Republican newspaper, the National Gazette, that would printed by Philip Freneau, that would be in charge of reprinting news from sources that Jefferson considered to be more reliable from Europe, especially a newspaper called the Leiden Gazette, which was published in the Netherlands. So Jefferson set Freneau up. He used his diplomatic contacts to ensure that he got a steady supply of the Leiden Gazette, and this succeeded in a sense for a while, because Freneau would publish this material and other newspapers would publish more of it. And so this was Jefferson's approach, right? Injecting public discourse with news published in continental Europe was very much an act of political activism, trying to push Americans' view of the world away from a British perspective and toward news sources that better aligned with Jefferson's vision for the United States. John Adams and the Federalists had a different approach. So several years later in 1798, Adams and his Federalist allies took a much more aggressive approach. They tried to address what they regarded as an unprecedented avalanche of falsehood by passing a law known as the Sedition Act, which promised prosecutions for anyone spreading any false, scandalous, and malicious writings against the government of the United States. And so I'm going to go through this quickly in the interest of time, but this sparked quite a backlash, even though it was in line with legal precedents from the British past, I should say, as Americans developed a more expansive view of the liberty of the press and liberty of speech. But this was the Federalist approach to this problem of falsehood. So we have, I think, in a lot of ways, a lot in common with the revolutionary generation. The United States of the early 21st century and the American people of the late 18th century were both experiencing a major media revolution. And ours is different in some meaningful ways, but the fundamental questions here are essentially still the same. In a time when more and more information is being consumed than ever before, how can we lead people to reject misinformation and seek out knowledge? Does living in a political democracy mean that truth is always decided by a plurality? And so I began this talk by indicating that it would be in large part about how the founding generation failed to solve the challenges of misinformation in a popular government. And just as a quick recap, they tried a lot of different ways to solve this problem. Patriot mobs attacked and intimidated rival loyalist presses. Patriot observers tried the techniques of contemporary media literacy to root out falsehoods, which backfired. And in the early republic, leaders took a few approaches. Some tried to frame the Constitution in such a way that would deprive ordinary people of political power because they feared that ordinary people were too easily deceived. Thomas Jefferson thought that he could combat the lies around him by creating a new partisan news source. And the Federalists under John Adams just decided that they would use the government to prosecute falsehood. These are all bad ideas, I think. Most of them provide a pretty poor model for us today. Some of you, though, might be thinking, okay, but you could argue that better media literacy would help us. And I think you'd be right. But it didn't work in the late 18th century because there was as yet no broader infrastructure of knowledge production. It took centuries, really, for Americans to develop the system of information distribution and verification that we have today. And it took even longer for institutions to arise outside of the media to impartially generate knowledge about the world. Unfortunately, a lot of these institutions are in decline today, if not crisis. Public schools, universities, local media archives, libraries, and government agencies are struggling to meet existing needs. And as these institutions decline, they produce less knowledge and can be less creative about thinking about how to share it with wider audiences. And so my conclusions are this fake news crisis isn't new. It's been a part of American democracy since the beginning. That we should avoid using the ineffective tools employed by the founding generations to solve the misinformation problem. And media literacy education and programming should focus on helping people to seek knowledge rather than on debunking falsehoods. And finally, that in order to be able to teach people to distinguish between information and knowledge, we have to support independent knowledge-creating institutions, and that means committing resources. These things might seem like they're small on their own, but I think that they add up to a more well-informed citizenry, which was something that over and over again the leaders of the American Revolution believed was essential to a strong, stable republic. The founders understood that politics lay downstream of perception. If you change people's information, you could change the ideologies, policies, and the politics that they'd support. And as much as I'd love to close here with a pithy quote from Alexander Hamilton or James Madison or something, I think I'm going to go with a quote from the equally great Lou Reed, in my opinion, who once sang a lyric that I think gets at the founders' fears and hopes about fake news. So he sang, "Oh, I do believe you are what you perceive. What comes is better than what came before." So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry I went a bit longer than I hoped. I don't know if there's time for maybe one question.
We may have time for one question before we close out. And so I will, there are a few that are here, but I'll go according to the list, which is, how did a news editor's or publisher's point of view affect news reports during the American Revolution and early Republic? That's from Alexander.
Yeah, it was, I think, quite determinative. They made choices, right, that aligned with their own preferences and the vision of the world that they wanted to see. And for instance, I didn't get into this too much, but with the French Revolution, if you wanted a more egalitarian society in the United States, you were more likely to buy into narratives that said that the French Revolution, this radical break from the past, had great consequences. That we should embrace this kind of approach specifically because it aligned with the political objectives of people in the United States.
Good deal. Thank you. And I'll ask another from Kathy. Her question is, was the Bible quoted in Loyalist and Patriot newspapers as justification of actions and or views?
That's a great question. That reminds me that I didn't get back to the question about religion because I skipped something in my haste. Yeah, absolutely. The Bible was one of many sources of authority that Patriots and Loyalists used really more in their political essays than in their sort of news gleanings. And so the Bible was read alongside, ancient Greek and Roman history, all kinds of history, really, and the political theory of people like Locke or Montesquieu or Sidney. And so these things kind of made this messy mixture of authority that Americans sort of dipped into whenever it was helpful for their arguments.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. I believe that is our time. Thank you for joining us, leading us, sharing your expertise, as well as exploring historical media literacy strategies of the 18th century, as well as considering approaches to how our teachers can incorporate media literacy education into their classrooms. As I look through the chat, everyone is collectively thanking you, giving their shout outs and everything. We appreciate you. And we look forward to hearing more about your work, especially at the center. Thank you all for spending your evening with us. A special thanks to Kyle Smith for your service on the Teacher Advisory Council, as well as your presence and contributions in the chat tonight. I'd encourage everyone to keep up with what's happening at the National Humanities Center through our various social media feeds to get updates on our events, as well as our ongoing activities and programming. I'd also invite you to check out our next webinar, which is scheduled for March 28th with Sarah McNamara out of Texas A&M University, entitled Understanding Latindades, Negotiating Region, Race, and Politics in the United States. Again, we appreciate you all joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again during our Humanities in Class webinar series. We have about a week break before we join, together again. But continue to do the great work that you are doing in your classrooms. Please know that we appreciate you, we value you, and if in any way we can support you all, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Be safe.